I was 18 years old when Harlan Aldrich came to take the farm, and I had not yet learned the difference between a thing that belongs to you and a thing that merely surrounds you. My grandfather, Harmon Cross, had tried to teach me that difference. He had tried to teach me a great many things sitting at the kitchen table in the evenings with his hands wrapped around a cup of coffee and his voice low and unhurried, the way men speak when they have learned that most important things cannot be said quickly. I had listened the way young people listen to old people, which is to say I heard the words and filed them in some back corner of my mind, where they sat unexamined for years, waiting for the particular kind of emergency that would force me to go looking for them. That emergency arrived on a Tuesday morning in June of 1884, with Harlan Aldrich and Sheriff DeWitt Coe riding side by side down the county road. I was in the kitchen when I heard the horses. My mother, Cecilia Cross, was at the table behind me, with her hands pressed flat against the wood, which was something she did when she was holding herself together. She had known they were coming. She had known since April, when the third notice arrived from the bank, and she had spent the intervening weeks in a state of deliberate calm that I now understand was not peace, but the exhaustion of a woman who had already grieved something and was waiting for the world to catch up with the grieving. My father, Jonas Cross, had died the previous winter. He had gone the way men go when they have worked too hard for too long, and the body finally presents its accounting. He was 44 years old, and he left behind a farm with 3 years of debt stacked on it like stones, a wife who had never handled money, and a daughter who had never handled anything more difficult than a bad harvest. The farm was 300 acres of good bottom ground on the eastern edge of Holt County. It had been ours in the way that things are yours when you have sweat into them and your family name is on the deed. But what is yours by sweat is not always yours by law, and the law in the summer of 1884 wore the face of Harlan Aldrich. He came to the door in a good wool coat despite the June heat, which told you something about the man. He produced documents from a leather satchel with the efficiency of someone who had done this before and did not expect complications. The title was held by the bank. The debt was outstanding and had been outstanding for 3 harvests running. We had 7 days to remove our personal belongings. My mother said nothing. She had no words available for that moment. Or perhaps she had too many and could not locate the right ones. I was the one who spoke. I told him we would be gone by morning. Harlan Aldrich looked at me the way adults look at 18-year-olds, who speak with more certainty than their years have earned them. A brief flicker of something between amusement and irritation. Then he closed the satchel and nodded and turned back to his horse. Sheriff DeWitt Coe sat on his mount the entire time and did not look at me directly. He was a decent man doing a legal thing, which is a particular kind of cowardice that is very hard to hold against someone. When the horses were gone, my mother turned to me and I saw in her face something I had never seen there before. Not grief, not fear, but the specific look of a person who has run out of capacity and is transferring a weight they can no longer carry. She was 41 years old, and she looked in that moment older than my grandfather Harmon had looked at 73. I thought about my grandfather. I need to tell you about Harmon Cross, because everything that happened afterward came from him, from the things he had tried to tell me that I had not listened to carefully enough while he was alive to repeat them. Harmon Cross had been a coal miner for most of his working life, starting in the anthracite fields of Schuylkill County, Pennsylvania, when he was 15 years old, and working underground for 35 years before his lungs told him firmly that the arrangement was over. He came out of that life with black permanently lodged in the creases of his knuckles, and a knowledge of the underground that was as intimate as any I have known between a person and a place. He could read the earth the way some people read weather, assessing the soil underfoot with a glance and a press of his boot heel, and telling you things about what lay beneath it that he could not entirely explain in words. He had moved west with my father's family in the late 1860s when the Homestead Act was still drawing people to Kansas like a bright promise written on flat land. He farmed for 15 years and was good at it, the way people who have worked underground are good at things that require patience and attention to what the earth is doing. He died in the winter of 1882, 2 years before the bank came for our farm, and he left me very little except a pair of worn leather work gloves, a root cellar he had half finished behind the barn, and a way of thinking about the ground that I had not yet understood was worth more than the farm itself. The root cellar was the thing. He had begun it the summer before he died, telling my father it was practical, telling me it was important and not quite finishing either explanation, before his health made such conversations difficult. It was dug 8 feet into the earth behind the main barn, roughly 12 feet by 10 feet across, with notched timber shoring along the walls and 2 lengths of iron pipe he had brought from a hardware supplier in Ellsworth. One pipe ran from near the floor of the cellar, outward through the earthen wall, angling upward to emerge behind a stand of juniper 40 feet from the barn. The other rose from near the ceiling and ran up through the barn wall, venting below the eaves on the north face. He had installed a wooden trapdoor at the top of the steep entry steps and fitted it with an iron latch. He brought me down into it one evening in August, the summer before he died. I was 15 years old, and the cellar smelled of earth and cool mineral, and something deeper that had no name I could give it. The temperature dropped noticeably as we descended, and I said so, and my grandfather set his hand flat against the earthen wall and said something I did not understand at the time. Not cold, Della, he said, even. There is a difference. He told me about thermal mass. He explained how the dense earth absorbed heat slowly and released it slowly, insulating the interior from the extremes above. He said that at 8 feet depth, the temperature in a Kansas root cellar stayed within a narrow range, regardless of the season, cool enough to preserve food through summer, warm enough to prevent freezing through winter. He told me about the ventilation pipes, how the cool, heavier air entered through the low pipe, and the warm, moist air escaped through the high one, creating a slow, continuous circulation that kept condensation from forming on the stored food and mold from taking hold in the still air. A root cellar is not a hole in the ground. He told me, holding the lantern so I could see the timber work along the walls. It is a pocket of yesterday's weather. The earth is always a season behind the sky. It remembers what the sky has already forgotten. I had nodded and helped him arrange the shelving boards along the walls and carried the first jars of preserved food down the steep steps and thought I understood what he was telling me. I did not understand. I had heard the words. I had not yet done the work that turns words into knowledge. That work was coming. In the week between Harlan Aldrich's visit and the morning we had to be gone, I did not pack the things a woman is supposed to pack when she is losing her home. I packed food, working before dawn in the blue, quiet hour when the sky is not yet fully committed to morning. I moved everything from our pantry and smokehouse by wheelbarrow, along the back field road 2 miles each way, carrying it to the old Abernathy place. The Abernathy barn had stood empty for more than a decade, the family having moved on after 2 failed crops and a death. The barn's roof sagged on the northwest corner, but the walls were sound and the main floor was solid. No one owned it in any active sense. No one was watching it. I moved the hams first, then the 60 jars of preserved beans and tomatoes and plums that my mother had put up the previous summer. Then the sacks of dried corn and flour and salt, taking a different route each morning so the wheel tracks would not form a clear path. My mother watched me do this and said nothing. On the fourth morning, she came with me and carried 2 jars at a time without speaking, which was its own kind of speech. I moved the tools last. The short-handled spade, the hatchet, the coil of rope, the hand saw, the lantern, the box of tallow candles. And from the half-finished root cellar behind our barn, I took the extra shoring timbers my grandfather had cut and stored under a tarp, the lengths of spare iron pipe, and the dairy thermometer he had hung on the earthen wall, an old instrument that still held mercury and still read accurately. On the 7th morning, my mother and I walked away from the house with our personal belongings in 2 canvas bags. We walked east on the county road until we were past the first rise, and then I turned to my mother and told her to go to her sister's house in Ellsworth. She looked at me for a long moment, and then she did something I think about still. She reached into her bag and took out my grandfather's work gloves, the pair that had been in our family since Pennsylvania, worn through at the left thumb and dark with decades of oil and earth, and she put them in my hands. "He would have wanted you to have them," she said. "He always said you were the one who would understand." I did not understand yet, but I would. The Abernathy barn was larger than I remembered from childhood. The hayloft still held sweet, dry grass. The tack room had a broken door that swung in the wind. In the far corner where the old milking stalls had been, the earthen floor was shielded from any sightline to the main doors. That was where I began. I measured the space with a coil of rope marking corners with stakes. 12 feet by 10 feet, 8 feet deep. Those were the dimensions my grandfather had used for the root cellar on our farm, and I trusted them because they were the only specifications I had. I had no expertise of my own. I had a dead man's instructions and a pair of worn gloves and the specific desperation of a person who has looked at all the available alternatives and found them insufficient. The work began on a Monday morning in late June, with the sun already hot at 7 in the morning, and the grasshoppers clicking in the dry grass outside. Nothing I had done before in my 18 years had prepared me for the physical reality of digging 8 feet into Kansas clay. I had worked hard my whole life. I had turned garden soil every spring and hauled water, and mended fence and done the 100 physical tasks of farm life without complaint or difficulty. This was entirely different. This was extraction. Dense, heavy clay came up in chunks that resisted the spade with a sullenness that felt personal, and each bucket I filled and carried up the ladder weighed more than I had expected, and the ladder was steeper than seemed reasonable, and the sun moved across the sky with a slowness that made the passage of time feel like something being done to me deliberately. I moved 10 buckets before my hands were raw. I moved 20 before the rawness became a burn that made me set the spade down and breathe carefully. I moved 30 before I understood that the burn was not going to stop me, and the only question was what kind of person I was going to discover myself to be in the working through it. I scattered the displaced earth in a low gully 100 yards from the barn, a little at a time, working it into the natural contours of the land, so there was no telltale mound. This was something my grandfather had mentioned once, almost in passing, that a cellar you wanted to keep private required that you disperse what you removed. I had filed that detail in the same back corner where I filed most of what he told me, and now I retrieved it and put it to use. By the end of the first day, I had 3 feet of depth and hands that bled when I flexed them, and a back that had opinions about my choices. I climbed into the hayloft as the light failed, and ate a small supper of dried corn and salt, and lay down in the sweet grass, and thought about my grandfather and his coal mine going underground day after day for 35 years, and I felt something that was not quite peace, but was in the vicinity of it. By the end of the first week, the hole was 4 feet deep, and the blisters on my palms had broken and healed and broken again, and were beginning slowly to turn toward callus. I developed a rhythm to the work: 3 hours of digging in the cooler morning air, an hour of dispersing the clay in the gully, then the slower work of setting shoring timbers along the walls as the hole deepened. I ate sparingly. In the evenings, I repaired gaps in the barn walls with rags and dried mud, and went to sleep with the particular tiredness of a body that has been used honestly all day. The second week of digging brought the first real failure. I had been shoring the walls as I went, driving timber planks vertically into the clay to prevent collapse, following what I thought was the standard method. My grandfather had mentioned shoring, but I had retained only the general concept, not the specifics. On the night of the 9th day, a hard rain came from the northwest, the kind that builds in the afternoon and breaks in the night, with a seriousness that turns roads to mud and creeks to temporary rivers. I was in the hayloft when I heard a sound from below that I did not immediately recognize, a low, wet, settling sound, the particular note of something giving way under pressure. I came down the ladder with the lantern and stood at the edge of the excavation and looked at what the rain had done. The east wall had collapsed. Nearly 4 feet of clay had sheared away in a single heavy slab, taking 2 of my vertical shoring planks with it. The bucket I had left at the bottom was buried. 3 days of work undone. I sat on the edge of the hole with the rain coming through the gaps in the roof and dripping on my shoulders, and looked at the ruin of what I had built, and let myself feel it for a few minutes, without trying to turn it into something useful. Then I thought about my grandfather. I thought about something specific he had told me that I had not fully understood at the time. He had been explaining the difference between driving timbers straight into a wall and notching them to interlock. And I had been half listening the way you half listen to technical details that have no context yet. He had said the earth wants to move sideways under pressure, not down, and you build your shoring to work with that tendency, not against it. Straight planks transmit the pressure from above straight through to the unstable earth below. Notched timbers locked into horizontal plates distribute the force laterally across the whole face of the wall. The wall becomes a single object instead of a collection of individual planks. I had not cut the notches. That was the error. I had taken the concept of shoring and applied the rough shape of it without the critical detail that made the concept actually work. I got up and found the hatchet and the handsaw in the rubble at the bottom of the hole and started clearing. It took 4 days to rebuild the collapsed section correctly. I cut every shoring timber with notched ends, fitting them into horizontal plates top and bottom, creating the interlocking frame my grandfather had described. The work was slower and more exacting, and I ruined 3 timbers getting the notch angle right before I had a method that produced consistent results. When the rebuilt section was done, I pressed my palm flat against the new shoring and pushed with everything I had. Nothing moved. I stood at the bottom of the hole in the lantern light and felt something different from anything I had felt in the previous 2 weeks. Not triumph exactly. Something more like recognition. The difference between a thing I had been told and a thing I now knew with my hands. My grandfather had tried to give me that knowing in words, and I had received only the outline of it. The 4 lost days and the ruined timbers and the clay in my hair at midnight were the price of converting the outline into the substance. I understood, standing at the bottom of that rebuilt hole, what he had been trying to give me 3 years before. Not cold, even. He had been trying to give me a way of thinking, not just a fact. The earth is even. It does not fluctuate. It holds what it was given and releases it slowly, and can be relied upon in a way that the sky with its droughts and blizzards and grasshopper years cannot. The sky is emotion. The earth is memory. Build your life accordingly. I had just learned something real for the first time. Real in the specific sense of knowledge that lives in the hands rather than the head. My grandfather had spent 35 years earning that kind of knowing, and had tried to give it to me as a gift, and I had nearly squandered it through inattention. I would not be inattentive again. July moved through its heat with the particular indifference of a Kansas July that is committed to its purpose. The sky stayed pale and hard, and the creek along the southern edge of the Abernathy land dropped steadily, its banks expanding as the water retreated, leaving cracked mud margins where the grass had been. The wheat in the surrounding fields grew to a height that suggested a decent harvest, but the stalks were thinner than they should have been, and the heads lighter, the kind of crop that feeds you for 1 year without building any reserves for the next. I finished the ventilation system on the 14th of August. Following my grandfather's design exactly, I dug 2 narrow channels from the cellar walls outward and fitted the iron pipes into them. The low pipe emerged behind a stand of scrub brush 40 feet from the barn, angled so that rain would not run directly into the opening, but air could move freely through it. The high pipe ran up through the barn wall inside a notched channel. I had cut into one of the main uprights, venting just below the eaves on the north face. The test was simple. I lit a candle at the low pipe opening and held it steady. The flame bent inward. The air was moving, flowing into the low opening through the cellar and out through the high pipe by natural convection. Warm air rising and escaping, while cool air drew in from outside to replace it. A slow, continuous breath, exactly as my grandfather had described in our root cellar when I was 15 years old and not yet ready to understand what I was hearing. I watched that candle for a long time. I was alone in an abandoned barn in the middle of a Kansas August, and the world above me was dry and difficult, and the world below me was even and cool, and the temperature at the bottom of the stairs read 56 degrees in the height of summer. For the first time since my father died, and the bank came for our farm, I felt something I could call by its right name. Ready. I provisioned the cellar through August and into September. I gathered wild plums from the thickets along the creek and cooked them into preserves over a small fire I built in a stone ring behind the barn, out of sight of the county road. I approached Vera Garner, who farmed the adjacent property with her husband and 3 children, and offered her a week of help with her canning in exchange for a share of her surplus beans and beets. Vera was a practical woman who had come to Kansas from Ohio and had shed several layers of social convention in the process of surviving it. She asked me no unnecessary questions and paid exactly what she agreed to pay, which made her exceptional in my experience. I traded 3 days of fence mending for a farmer named Willis, 2 miles east, in exchange for 2 additional lengths of stovepipe and a flat soapstone that would serve as a small heater in the loft through winter. I mended the roof on the northwest corner with shingles I found stacked in the tack room. I sealed the gaps in the barn walls with a mixture of clay and dried grass. I carried water from the creek in the mornings when it still ran and stored it in the barrel I had brought from our farm. By the end of August, the cellar shelves held 64 jars of preserved food. The sacks of dried beans and flour and corn, the salt pork and its crock-braided onions hung from the ceiling joists, and a small hard wheel of cheese I had made myself from the milk of a neighbor's surplus cow. I drove a nail into the earthen wall near the foot of the stairs and hung my grandfather's dairy thermometer on it. In the lantern light, the mercury read 56 degrees. The thermometer nailed to the outside of the barn read 93. I stood in the cellar for a long moment, feeling the difference between those 2 numbers in my body. Not the intellectual understanding of it, but the physical fact. The even underground cool surrounding me while the summer pressed against the barn walls above, with a weight and heat that felt almost aggressive. My grandfather had told me this would be so. He had told me in words in that cellar on our farm 3 years ago, and the words had reached me then, but not the understanding behind them. Now I understood. I climbed back up through the trapdoor and sat on the main floor of the barn in the dimness and talked to my grandfather the way you talk to someone who is not there, in the particular quiet voice that is not quite prayer and not quite conversation, but something with qualities of both. You were right, I told him. You were right about all of it. The grasshoppers were the first sign that summer had intentions I had not accounted for. In the last days of August, I noticed things that the farmers of promise were too close to their work to see. The grasshoppers were different, not in number, not yet, but in behavior. They were clustering on warm surfaces in the afternoons, the barn walls and fence posts, and the south faces of rocks resting with their bodies oriented in a way I had not seen before. They were grouping rather than dispersing, and the grouping had a quality to it I associated with preparation rather than rest. I could not have told you why I knew what this meant. My grandfather had told me about a grasshopper swarm he had heard described by men who witnessed one back before I was born. He spoke of the days before as being marked by a particular aggregating behavior in the local population. The insects gathering before the main body arrived as though called by something humans could not hear. He said the insects rested on warm surfaces with their bodies pointed toward the southwest. He said the air had a particular brittle quality to it, a dry pressure like something held at tension. I had been a child when he told me this, and I had retained it because he told it with a specificity that lodged in the memory the way precise details do, in a way that generalities never quite manage. Standing in the late August afternoon outside the Abernathy barn, watching a line of grasshoppers on the south wall, with their bodies arranged in a direction that made my stomach go cold, I understood that he had given me another gift in that telling, and that I needed to use it immediately. I went inside and began moving everything I had not already stored into the cellar. I worked with the focused urgency of someone who understands that the time available is shorter than it looks. In Promise, 2 miles east, the summer wound down in its ordinary rhythms. The wheat harvest was underway. The general store had full shelves. Harriet Farwell, the preacher's wife, organized the Tuesday sewing circle with her usual thoroughness. Harlan Aldrich had ridden out twice in August to inspect the Abernathy property from the county road, assessing it with the detached professional eye of a man who owns things he has not worked and had seen nothing to trouble him. He did not come close enough to see the repaired roof or the new fence wire along the south boundary. The town of Promise had reached a comfortable conclusion about Della Cross. She was 18 years old, alone without resources in a dry Kansas August. Her mother had gone to relatives in Ellsworth. The girl herself had simply disappeared into the geography of a county large enough to absorb the quietly desperate without anyone needing to account for them. Harriet Farwell said a prayer for her at the Tuesday circle and moved on to the next subject. The prayer was sincere. The moving on was also sincere. Both things can be true at once. They did not know about the cellar. They did not know about the 64 jars on the shelves, or the candle flame bending in the ventilation draft, or the girl sitting on an overturned crate in the underground cool, running her finger along the timber work and thinking about a man who had spent 35 years underground, learning what the earth holds in its memory. The 1st of September came in with a heat that had no give in it. I sealed the last of the ventilation pipe joints with a mixture of clay and ash and moved the final stores into the cellar through the long afternoon. When I climbed back up through the trapdoor, for the last time that evening, the grasshoppers outside were continuous, their sound, a single unbroken tone rather than individual clicking. I had never heard it quite that way before, but my grandfather had described it exactly. I closed the trapdoor and latched it and went up to the hayloft and did not sleep well. The morning of the 3rd of September began still and white with a sky the color of bleached cotton and an air so quiet that the barn felt sealed from everything beyond its walls. I was eating my small breakfast in the loft when I heard it first as a pressure below. Hearing a vibration I felt in my back teeth before my ears registered it, and then as a roar from somewhere to the southwest that did not belong to weather or wind or any ordinary thing. I walked to the gap in the barn wall and looked west. The sky was moving, not clouds, something brown and dense that rose from the horizon line and spread sideways as it came, dimming the sun to a pale orange disk, behind the thickness of it casting a strange amber light over the fields that made everything look preserved like something seen through old glass. I had perhaps 3 minutes of watching before the sound became something that pressed against the ears, and the air in front of the barn went thick with bodies. They came in a mass that was beyond what the word swarm can hold. The grasshoppers arrived as weather, as a biological atmosphere that replaced the ordinary air with something that clicked and whirred and consumed. They covered the ground within seconds. They covered the barn walls. They covered the fence posts and the dried creek bed and the scrub grass and every available surface with a density that seemed impossible, as though the air itself had decided to become solid and alive. The sound of feeding began within the first minute, a collective sharp rasping that I can describe only as the sound of the world being erased at the surface. I did not run or panic. I walked to the trapdoor, lifted. It went down the stairs and pulled it shut over my head. The cellar was dark except for the candle I lit from the shelf box. I sat on the overturned crate at the bottom of the steps and placed my palms flat on the stone floor and felt the vibration of what was happening above me transmitted through the earth into my hands. A faint, rhythmic trembling, almost like a pulse. The candle flame stood perfectly straight. The air moved in its slow, continuous circuit through the pipes, cool and clean and entirely indifferent to the catastrophe taking place 12 feet above my head. I stayed in the cellar through the rest of that day and all of the next. When I lifted the trapdoor on the morning of September the 5th, the silence reached me before the light did, not the ordinary silence of an early morning. Something with a different quality, the silence of subtraction, of a world from which something essential has been removed. I climbed out and stood on the main floor of the barn and looked through the gaps in the wall at what remained of the landscape. The fields were gone, not damaged or thinned, gone. The wheat stubble that remained was pale and chewed to within an inch of the soil. The grass along the creek had been stripped to bare earth. The cottonwood trees along the fence line had been taken of their leaves and stood with bare branches in the September heat, like something from the wrong season. The kitchen garden I could see behind the Garner farmhouse was stems and nothing else. I stood in the barn doorway for a long time and let myself look at it. Then I went down into the cellar and lit the candle and checked the thermometer. The mercury held at 56 degrees. I checked the shelves. Every jar was intact. The sacks were untouched. The salt pork sat undisturbed in its crock. I held the candle near the low pipe and the flame bent toward it. The same gentle pull it had made on the first day I tested it in August. Confirmation that the system was still breathing. I sat on the crate in the underground cool and thought about my grandfather, who had tried to give me this and had succeeded despite my inattention, and despite the distance between words and knowing, and despite the fact that he died before he could finish what he started. "You built good, Grandpa Harmon," I said into the cellar air. "You built better than you knew." The candle burned straight and still. In the town of promise, the silence that followed the swarm was of a different kind. And I heard about it from Vera Garner, who came to the barn 3 days later with her youngest child on her hip, and a look on her face that was new to me, not the practical, capable expression I had come to know from our canning transactions, something that had cracked open underneath it. She told me about the harvest, what had been cut and stored before the third was safe. What had still been standing in the fields when the swarm arrived was gone without exception. Lester Pruitt, who had been cutting his last section on the afternoon of the second, had lost perhaps a third of his year's yield. The Calloway family north of town, who had been waiting for the grain to dry a few more days, had lost nearly everything they had left standing. She told me about the kitchen garden, which was her family's supplemental food supply through winter. She told me her husband had been sitting on the porch in the evenings, saying very little doing the arithmetic that does not come out right, no matter how many times you run it. She told me her children were asking questions she did not know how to answer. I listened and gave her 4 jars from the cellar, 2 of preserved tomatoes and 2 of pickled beans, and told her to come back in 2 weeks. She looked at me with something new in her expression when I said that. Something that contained gratitude and a question that had not yet formed into words. I did not wait for the question. There would be time for questions. The winter was coming, and with it the full weight of what the grasshoppers had taken, and I had work to do before I could answer anything. The weeks after the swarm were a slow unwinding the way a crisis always reveals itself, not in the initial blow, but in the weeks of reckoning that follow. The grasshoppers had eaten and moved on. What remained was the arithmetic of their passage, and that arithmetic was being done in every farmhouse in Holt County, with results that did not comfort. The shelves at the general store in Promise began to show gaps that were not filled. What goods remained were repriced upward by a storekeeper who understood supply and demand and was not unsympathetic but also had a family of his own to consider. A barrel of cornmeal that had cost 40 cents in August cost 70 cents in October. Flour was rationed. Salt pork could be had, but at a price that assumed a kind of prosperity the community no longer possessed. Harriet Farwell organized prayer meetings on Tuesday and Thursday evenings. She was a capable woman, and her organizational skills were genuine, and the community benefited from the structure she provided. But I had spent enough time with my grandfather in his last years to have absorbed something about the relationship between faith and practicality, which is that they are not competitors and do not need to be, but that they also do not substitute for each other. Prayer sustains the spirit through a cold night. Stored food keeps the body alive until morning. Both are necessary. Neither is sufficient alone. I moved my sleeping quarters from the hayloft fully into the barn's main floor in the first week of October. The soapstone I had traded for went into the corner on a flat stone base, and I began rationing my woodpile, carefully burning exactly 3 pounds of wood each night against a projected winter of 5 months. I had done the calculation with a piece of charcoal on a board, and then done it again because the number seemed tight, and the second calculation confirmed the first. 3 pounds a night, not more. My meals were a discipline. A cup of boiled beans at midday, a small piece of salt pork in the evening, a spoonful of preserved plums when the cold made the evening meal feel insufficient. I ate the same quantities every day regardless of whether I was hungry, which is a habit my grandfather had, and which he explained to me as simply as he could. You do not eat when you are hungry on a ration, he had told me. You eat on the schedule. Hunger is an opinion. The food stores are a fact. Run the facts, not the opinions. I descended into the cellar every other morning. The routine had a quality of meditation to it. The lifting of the trap door, and the cool air rising around me before I even reached the stairs, that particular underground steadiness that the world above could not touch. I checked each shelf by candlelight, pressing the jar lids for signs of seal failure, checking the sacks for softness that might mean rot. I checked the thermometer, 56 degrees through October and into November, 57 in the first week of December, when the cold above was so extreme that even the deep earth shifted slightly in its temperature. My grandfather had been right about every measurement and every principle. The timber work held against the winter moisture with the solidity I had proven with my own hands in August. The ventilation breathed steadily through frost and wind and the long compression of a Kansas cold season. The thermal mass of the surrounding earth maintained its remembered temperature against the cold above, with the patience of something that has never been required to hurry. I was not comfortable. I want to be accurate about that. I was cold in the mornings before the soapstone had taken the overnight chill from the barn. My hands were often numb at the first task of the day, The monotony of the ration was genuine, not something I romanticize now that it is past. But I was alive and I was fed, and my stores were intact. The winter was outside the barn walls where it belonged, and the cellar below me held enough to last. In promise, the suffering was the quiet, grinding kind, which is in some ways harder to witness than dramatic catastrophe, because it happens in increments too small to require a response at any individual moment. And by the time the accumulation is visible, it has been going on for a long time already. The Garner family slaughtered their milk cow in the second week of November because the cost of feeding her through winter exceeded what the family could bear. The cow had a name. The children cried. Then they ate beef through the end of the month, and when the beef was gone, there was nothing to replace it. The Schmidt boy, 12 years old, took fever in the first week of December and did not recover. His death moved through the community the way a young death moves, touching each family with the particular cold knowledge that the margin was thinner than anyone had been willing to say aloud before now. I heard these things from Vera Garner when she came to the barn with her youngest child, and a look that said she was measuring the distance between dignity and necessity, and finding it shorter than it had ever been in her life. I gave her 4 more jars and told her to come back. She came back, and the second time she came, she brought her husband, a quiet man named Philip, who said very little and assessed things with the thoroughness of someone who does his thinking before he speaks. He looked at the barn. He looked at me. He said he was a strong man and a good carpenter, and he would work for food. And he named his rate in terms of labor per week for a measured amount of supplies, which was the structure of a transaction, not a request for charity. I took his offer. I opened the ledger I had started keeping in October and wrote his name and the terms and the date and turned it for him to see. He read it carefully and signed it. His name was the second in the ledger after Vera's. The word moved through Promise the way genuine information moves in a community under pressure, not as gossip, but as current the way news travels when people need it and trust it. Philip Garner was not a man given to embellishment. He spoke of the barn and the cellar, factually describing the temperature and the system of pipes and the stored food, the way he would describe a reliable piece of farm equipment. He said the terms were fair. He said Delacrosse was keeping a ledger. Within a week, others came. A widow named Greta Hollis arrived with 2 daughters and offered her skill at mending and quilting in exchange for flour and dried beans. Cyrus Brand, the blacksmith from town, whose forge had been cold since October, for lack of customers with the means to pay, offered to repair my tools and fabricate new hardware for the barn doors, in exchange for enough food to see his family through January. Each person I received at the barn door I listened to carefully and assessed the offer and the need and the fairness of the transaction. And I wrote it in the ledger in the hand my grandfather had taught me, steady and small and precise. I was not dispensing mercy. That distinction matters, and I want to make it clearly. Mercy is given freely without accounting. What I was doing was organizing survival according to principles that had nothing to do with sentiment. The ledger was not a record of charity. It was a record of what a community could produce for itself when someone was willing to keep the accounts honestly and hold the terms to a standard that preserved everyone's dignity on both sides of the transaction. My grandfather had kept accounts his whole life. He had told me that the most important thing about keeping accounts is that you apply the same standard to everyone, regardless of how you feel about them. And that the second most important thing is that you never extend more credit than the other party can reasonably repay, because debt that cannot be repaid destroys people, and the destruction is not the debtor's fault alone. I thought about this as I wrote names in the ledger and assigned terms that were fair but firm, not more generous than the stores could support, and not harder than the circumstances required. I was 18 years old. keeping accounts for a community of adults, some of whom were old enough to be my grandparents, and none of them challenged the fairness of the terms, because the terms were in fact fair. And fairness is recognized even when it is inconvenient to acknowledge. The crisis that came in the second week of December was the closest I came during that entire winter to losing everything. And I want to tell it plainly, because it was the moment that tested everything my grandfather had built and everything I had learned from the building. The temperature had been dropping for 3 days in a way that felt deliberate. By the evening of the 14th of December, the barn wall thermometer read 19 below zero, and the wind from the northwest was sustained and hard, pushing fine snow through every gap in the walls I had not found. I was in my corner of the main floor with the soapstone burning and my grandfather's gloves on my hands when I smelled something that stopped me entirely. Moisture, not the ordinary damp of a winter barn. Something close and organic, a heaviness in the air that did not belong to wood or hay or cold. I sat still for a moment, identifying it. Then I knew. The upper ventilation pipe was blocked. I went to the trapdoor and lifted it, and the smell was stronger below a faint beginning of something going wrong in the still air. I understood what this meant, because my grandfather had warned me about it specifically. When the upper pipe blocks the warm, moist air produced by the stored food, has nowhere to go. It collects against the jar lids and the wooden shelves. Condensation begins. Condensation becomes mold. Mold in a root cellar spreads with a thoroughness that can destroy months of preserved food in days. The upper pipe vented through the barn wall below the eaves on the northeast corner. To reach it, I would need to climb the exterior wall in 19 below zero and a sustained northwest wind. I stood at the bottom of the cellar stairs and thought about this with the particular clarity that genuine emergency produces. Not panic, not paralysis. A very clean and focused assessment of what was required and what it would cost. I put on every piece of clothing I owned in layers. The 2 wool undershirts, the heavy wool dress, the flannel overskirt, my grandfather's wool coat, that still smelled faintly of the mine dust that had never entirely left the fabric, even after years of washing the oilskin over that. The gloves, the scarf wrapped twice around my face, leaving only my eyes uncovered. I tied a rope to the main support beam inside the barn and paid it out through the small access door at the base of the east wall, then went outside with the rope in my hand. The cold at 19 below was a different category of experience than any cold I had known before. It was not a temperature. It was a medium you move through something with physical presence and intent. And it worked on exposed skin with an immediacy that was genuinely frightening. My eyes watered the moment I stepped outside, and the moisture froze on my lashes within seconds. I kept my face turned slightly from the direct wind and found the barn wall with both hands, and began to climb using the protruding ends of the horizontal boards as footholds. The pipe opening was buried under ice nearly 2 inches thick, formed around a blockage of packed snow in the bore. I worked at it with a short-handled screwdriver I had put in my coat pocket, before going out chipping with the deliberate economy of someone who understands that the hands inside the gloves have a limited working time before they stop responding correctly. The wind pulled at me continuously. I did not look down. The ice broke in a single piece, and the packed snow behind it released immediately, dropping on my shoulder, and I felt the pipe shudder faintly as pressure equalized and air began to move again. I held the back of my bare wrist against the pipe opening for 3 seconds and felt the faint warmth of the exhaust air on my skin. Climbing down was harder than climbing up had been. My hands were not numb, but they were slow, responding to instruction with a delay that scared me. I used the rope to lower myself the last 4 feet and went inside the barn and stood in the dark, breathing carefully until my hands worked correctly again. I went down into the cellar and checked the jars by candlelight. The condensation bloom on the lids was already beginning to clear as the circulation resumed. Nothing was lost. I held the candle near the low pipe and the flame bent toward it, steady and true, the same gentle pull it had made on the first day I tested it in August. I said aloud into the empty cellar, in a voice I had barely used since June, because there had been no one to direct it toward Grandpa Harmon. You were right about the 2 pipes. You were right about all of it. Then I sat on the crate for a while and let myself feel the full relief of having come through something that was genuinely dangerous. After a while, I blew out the candle and sat in the complete underground dark, listening to the faint movement of air through the pipes. That sound had become the sound of safety to me, faint and continuous and steady, the sound of a system working as it was designed to work, because a man who understood the earth had designed it correctly, and a girl who had finally understood his design had built it with her own hands. I climbed back up and sealed the trapdoor and went to bed. January arrived with the deliberate cruelty of a Kansas January that has committed to its purpose. The temperature stayed below 0 for 11 consecutive days. The snow from the earlier storms had compressed under its own weight, and the wind had carved it into shapes that looked permanent. The county road was indistinguishable from the surrounding landscape for days at a time. Promise was cut off from the rail line at Ellsworth for more than a week. The families in my ledger were surviving, thin, cold, eating simply but with food, and with the particular steadiness that comes from having terms they understood and supplies they could count on. The families outside the ledger were enduring a different kind of winter. I thought often during January about Harlan Aldrich. He had not come to the barn. I had anticipated this, and I was patient. Aldrich was a man whose entire architecture of self required that he be the one with leverage, the one whose terms other people accepted. He was 50 years old, and he had spent his adult life in the position of the man who held the paper, and coming to a girl he had dispossessed in June in a barn. On land he considered his to ask for anything at all. This was a cost that his particular kind of pride was not yet ready to pay. I understood this not because I was wise, but because my grandfather had explained men like Aldrich to me, once sitting at the kitchen table in the months before he died. He said that a man who has built his sense of himself entirely around the possession of leverage over others will do almost anything before he gives up that leverage, and that the worst thing you can do to such a man is take away all his alternatives until the only one left is to come to you honestly. Winter, I thought, would do the work, and I waited. The waiting ended on the 17th of January. I heard the barn door latch before I saw who was working it, and I knew from the sound alone the clumsy, repeated contact of hands that were not responding correctly to what they were asked to do. I was on the main floor, and I went to the door and opened it from inside before he managed it himself. Harlan Aldrich stood in the barn doorway. He wore the same good wool coat he had worn when he came to my family's farm in June, a coat that was well made and completely insufficient for the mile of open road he had walked in 17 below 0. His face was a color I did not like, grayish-white at the cheekbones, in a way that told me he had been outside longer than was wise. He gripped a small leather purse in one hand, with the rigidity of a man holding on to the last form of something that still belonged to him. He did not speak immediately. He stood in the doorway and breathed, watching his breath disappear into the cold air behind him. And he looked at me with an expression I had not seen before on that face. Not the crisp authority of the June morning. Not the cold assessment of the man with the satchel and the legal documents. Something stripped of all that. Something much simpler and much harder to look at. The expression of a man who has run out of alternatives and knows it. "Come in," I said, and closed the door. He came in. He sat at the small table I kept on the main floor, and I set a tin cup of hot water in front of him, the closest thing I had to tea, and waited while he wrapped his hands around it, and the color began returning to his face by degrees. He told me his wife had been ill since November, What had begun as an ordinary chest ailment had settled into something deeper, a persistent fever and a cough that kept her awake through the nights and left her too exhausted by morning to eat. The doctor, who came out from Ellsworth on the days the road was passable, had said she needed warmth and nourishing food consistently. Broth and soft-cooked things, not the crackers and cold storage apples that were all that remained in the Aldrich household by the 3rd week of January. He set the leather purse on the table between us. "Name your price," he said. "Whatever it is, I will pay it." His voice had the tight, controlled quality of a man delivering rehearsed words, choosing them instead of feeling them, because feeling them would cost too much in that moment. I looked at the purse. Then I looked at him. I reached across and moved the purse to the side, not contemptuously, just out of the way you move something that is not relevant to the current question. I opened the ledger to a fresh page. "The price is the same for everyone who comes to this table," I told him. "It is not paid in money." He watched me smooth the page with my palm. I dipped the pen and looked at him directly. "You will sign a document witnessed by DeWitt Co., releasing the bank's claim on the Abernathy property. The full 160 acres free and clear title transferred to me. And you will write a letter to the county judge stating that the foreclosure on my family's farm was executed against a debt that is hereby forgiven in full. Both documents properly witnessed before I give you anything from this cellar." The silence that followed had a texture to it. He stared at me across the small table, and I watched him run the arithmetic the way a man works through numbers he does not want to reach the end of. "You are 18 years old," he said, finally. His voice had lost the rehearsed quality entirely. He said it the way a man names a fact he cannot find a way around. "I know how old I am," I told him. He looked at me for another moment. Then he said that would ruin me, not a protest. A plain statement of fact, offered the way a man names a thing when the pretense of bargaining has been stripped away. I set the pen on the table between us. "Your wife is ill, Harlan," I said, not a threat. A fact placed alongside the other facts on the table, the ledger, the purse that was not the currency required the pen, the clean page. I said it the way my grandfather spoke when he was being most honest, without emphasis or drama. Just the plainest possible statement of what was true. He sat with it for a long time. The barn around us was quiet. Outside, the wind moved against the walls in its slow, persistent way. The soapstone in the corner ticked as it cooled. I waited. He reached for the pen. He wrote the letter to the county judge first, his handwriting less controlled than it would have been at the bank on an ordinary day, but legible and complete, stating that the foreclosure on the Cross family farm had been executed against a debt that the bank was hereby forgiving in full, and that the family's title should be considered restored. He signed it. Then I wrote out the document concerning the Abernathy land in 3 plain sentences and pushed it across the table. He read every word. He leaned forward and his eyes moved to the final clause, the one about full conveyance of mineral and water rights, along with the surface title. He pulled the document toward him and drew a thin line through that clause. "The surface land is what we are discussing," he said. "The mineral rights stay with the bank." He said it with the first trace of his former composure, the professional reflex of a man who has spent 30 years finding the negotiable edge in every transaction. I took the document from his hands. I looked at the line he had crossed out. I crossed out his crossing out with 2 firm strokes that restored the original text, and I set the document back in front of him and picked up the pen and held it and looked at him without speaking. He looked at the document. He looked at me. Whatever he found in my expression, it appeared to settle something for him. He picked up the pen and signed. I sent word to DeWitt Co. the following morning. The sheriff arrived on horseback, with his face reddened by the cold, and the wary expression of a man who suspects he is about to be handed something complicated. I set both documents in front of him, and he read them slowly. The way DeWitt Coe read everything without hurry and without comment until he had reached the end. Then he looked at Aldrich, who was sitting in the same chair he had occupied the day before. And he looked at me, and he took the pen I offered him and signed both documents as witness. His signature was steady and clear. When DeWitt Coe left, I went down into the cellar. I filled the basket with care. A full cured ham, the best one I had left. 6 jars of the chicken broth I had put up in September. Rich and golden, the kind of broth a sick woman could take in small amounts through the day and feel the warmth of it moving into her. 2 pounds of dried beans, a measure of flour, a piece of salt pork. The same basket I would have put together for the Garner family, or for Greta Hollis, or for any of the names in the ledger. The same measure, the same care. Not more and not less. I carried it up and set it on the table. Harlan Aldrich looked at the basket for a moment, and I looked away. Because what happened in his face then was private, the kind of thing that should happen without a witness if it can. I went to the door and looked out at the flat, white January landscape while he composed himself. When I heard the chair move, I turned back. He was standing with the basket in his hands. He looked at me for a moment without speaking. Then he walked out of the barn and did not look back. I stood in the doorway and watched him go. Harlan Aldrich walked away across the white ground toward the county road, a figure getting smaller carrying a basket he had not been able to buy with money. And the January morning was very bright and very still. And the cold came in around the edges of the doorway, and I let it for a moment, feeling it on my face. I went back inside and wrote his name in the ledger, the terms, the date, the basket's contents itemized in my small, clear hand. The column for labor owed I left blank, the only blank in the entire ledger, because what Harlan Aldrich owed me was not expressible in days of fence mending or carpentry. I closed the ledger and sat with my hands flat on its cover. The land was mine. 160 acres of the Abernathy place free and clear. My family's farm unencumbered. The debt that had crushed 3 harvests was gone. The document that had erased me in June had itself been erased. I did not feel triumph. I want to say that plainly because triumph would have been the wrong feeling, and I have tried in my life to feel the right feeling about things, which requires some honesty about what a thing actually is. What I felt was something more like the completion of an equation. The moment when a long calculation finally arrives at a number that accounts for all the variables. My grandfather had built the principles. I had built the application of them. The winter had done the rest. February came in hard and stayed hard. The cold that had characterized January did not relent, but settled into the county with the permanence of a condition cold that was no longer an event, but a fact woven into every hour of every day. The families in my ledger were thin, but they were alive, and they had terms they understood and stores they could count on. The community of promise had made it through the worst of the winter on the reserves that the ledger represented, and the knowledge of this was beginning to alter something in the way people spoke to each other. Vera Garner came in early February, not for food, but to talk. She sat at my table for 2 hours, and at the end of it, she asked me a direct question. She said, "How did you know what to do?" I told her about my grandfather. I told her about the coal mine in Pennsylvania and the root cellar on our farm, and the afternoon he had taken me down into it when I was 15 and tried to give me an understanding I was not yet ready to receive. I told her about the timber work and the 2 pipes and the thermal mass and the temperature reading, and I told her about the night I climbed the barn wall in 19 below zero to clear the block pipe. I told it plainly without dramatizing it, because the plainness was more truthful than any emphasis I could have added. When I finished, Vera was quiet for a moment. Then she said, "My husband wants to dig one." That was the beginning of the second thing that happened that winter. Philip Garner came the next day with a diagram he had sketched of his farm layout and questions about soil composition and pipe placement and timber sizing. He sat at my table with the patience of a man who intends to hear every word before responding. I answered his questions as precisely as I could, pointing to the measurements my grandfather had used and explaining the principles behind each specification. The reason for the 8 feet of depth, the logic of the notch, the function of each pipe, the test with the candle flame. He came back 2 days later with 2 other men who had questions of their own. I received them the same way, patient, precise, answering what was asked and not more, because my grandfather had told me once that the best teaching gives the other person enough to continue on their own, not so much that they become dependent on you to interpret it for them. By the middle of February, there were 4 families actively planning cellars, each one adapted to the particular conditions of their land by the person building it. Albert Crane, a farmer north of town, came with a modification he had thought of based on the specific clay composition of his section and asked whether the modification was sound. I looked at his drawing and asked him 3 questions about his prevailing wind direction and the slope of his land and the nearest reliable water table depth. And then I told him the modification was sound and explained precisely why. He looked at me when I finished, this man who was at least 40 years older than I was, and he said something I have thought about many times since. "You talk like your grandfather," he said. "Philip Garner told me about him. A man who understood the earth." "Yes," I said, "he did." Albert Crane came back 2 weeks later with 2 other farmers, and then 3 more came the week after that. I charged nothing for the instruction. My grandfather had not charged me. What he gave me he received as a gift, shaped by 35 years of underground work, and delivered to me across the kitchen table in the evenings of his last years. You cannot charge for that kind of knowledge. The charging would damage something in it, would introduce a transaction into something that was never meant to be transactional. The knowledge was meant to be used and passed on, and the passing on was its own kind of payment. The winter continued through February and into March, with the slow, deliberate patience of a Kansas winter that has not yet finished its point. The temperatures began to moderate in the 3rd week of February, not warmly but with less conviction than they had held before, the cold loosening its grip by degrees. The county road became passable again. The rail line to Ellsworth resumed service. Goods arrived at the general store in quantities that said the worst was genuinely behind the community. Lester Pruitt returned to the barn in the 1st week of March, a day when the temperature had risen above freezing for the first time in 2 months, and the eaves dripped and the air smelled of approaching spring. He came with Albert Crane and Willis the farmer, who had traded stovepipe for fence mending back in August. They came with tools in Willis's wagon. Lester said they were there to do the east wall repairs he had contracted for in December, and they had brought the others because the work would go faster with 3. I looked at the 3 of them standing in my barn doorway and thought about what my grandfather had said about the arithmetic of useful knowledge, that its value does not decrease when it is given away, that it increases. I moved aside and told them to come in. They worked for 2 days on the east wall, and the work they did was better than the specification I had given. When it was done, Lester stood back and looked at it with the expression of a man who has discharged an obligation precisely and is not displeased with how the discharging came out. He told me that the Crane cellar was almost finished, that the Watson family north of town had begun digging the previous week and were already 4 feet down, and that a woman named Temperance Bly, who farmed alone south of Promise, had asked him to pass along a question about ventilation pipe sizing for a cellar in clay soil with a high water table. "Tell Mrs. Bly to come see me," I said. She came the next day. Temperance Bly was a woman of perhaps 50 with the direct manner of someone who has been making decisions alone for a long time and has stopped finding it remarkable. She sat at my table with a hand-drawn diagram of her proposed cellar and asked her questions in the specific practical language of a person who wants to understand the principle so she can apply it herself, not just receive an answer. She would have to return and ask about again. I liked her immediately. She reminded me of my grandfather and the quality of her attention. We talked for 3 hours. I showed her the cellar, the timberwork and the ventilation pipes and the thermometer on its nail. She descended the stairs and stood on the stone floor in the cool underground air and pressed her palm against the shoring timbers and asked exactly the question my grandfather had asked me to consider. Why does the notch matter? I told her what my grandfather had told me, using his words where I could remember them, and my own words where I could not. And I told her about the collapse of the east wall, in my first weeks of digging and what I had understood from rebuilding it correctly. The knowledge that lives in the hands, I said, is different from the knowledge that lives in the head. The hand's knowledge costs something to earn. The cost is what makes it stay. She nodded slowly, the way my grandfather had nodded when he understood something with his whole attention, rather than just the surface of it. She came back 2 weeks later to report that her cellar was 6 feet down and the shoring was holding. The spring of 1885 came in with a generosity that felt like the land's acknowledgement of what the previous year had asked of the people working it. The snow receded from the fields in March, revealing soil that was dark and rested and ready. And the planting that happened in April had a different quality from the ordinary hope of planting. The people who planted had been through something together, and they knew it. And the knowing was in the work, in the way they moved through the fields and spoke to each other at the fence lines. I returned to the Cross family farm in the first week of April. The house was there empty and cold from a winter of disuse, the kitchen garden overgrown, the fences needing work. The bank had made no improvements during the months they held the title, and the land showed it in the particular way that land shows the absence of care. I spent the first morning walking the 300 acres from corner to corner, moving slowly, feeling the ground underfoot the way my grandfather had taught me, pressing the ball of my foot into the soil and reading the density of it. The land was good. The soil was dark and rich in the bottom fields, and the drainage was adequate, and the water table where I checked it in the southeast corner was at a depth that would support a proper well. I started with the root cellar. The half-finished one my grandfather had dug behind the main barn was structurally sound but incomplete. The shoring he had put in was correctly notched his work, and it had held through the winter. The ventilation pipes were in place but not properly sealed at the joints. The shelving was roughed in but not finished. I spent 3 days completing what he had started, sealing the pipe joints with clay and ash, finishing the shelves with boards I squared and cut myself, adding a second entry ladder with handrails because the steep steps were dangerous when your hands were full. On the 3rd day, I went down into the finished cellar with the dairy thermometer and hung it on a nail on the earthen wall and lit a candle and held it near the low pipe. The flame bent. I sat on the bottom step for a while in the cool underground air and thought about my grandfather going underground at 15 in a Pennsylvania coal mine and spending the better part of his life learning what the earth held and how to work with it, and then the effort to give it away to a granddaughter who was not yet ready to receive it. He had given it anyway. That was the thing. He had taught me, regardless of my inattention, with the patience of someone who plants a seed in soil that is not ready and trusts the soil will be ready eventually. I had been the soil. The spring moved through April and into May with the deliberate abundance of a season that has decided to compensate for what the previous year took. The wheat came up straight and strong. The kitchen gardens were replanted, and the creek ran full with snowmelt, and the general store restocked, and the community of promise moved forward through the ordinary business of recovery, which is the slow, practical work of rebuilding what was lost, one piece at a time. Other women came to learn. The men had come for the specifications, the measurements and the timber cuts and the pipe placement. The women came for something I had not anticipated when the first ones arrived at my door. They came because they had heard that a girl of 18 had survived a grasshopper year and a Kansas winter alone in an abandoned barn, with stores and principles that kept a community alive while others suffered. And they wanted to understand how that was possible. Harriet Farwell came one Tuesday afternoon, which struck me as notable, given that she had been the one to tell my mother in June that no one would think less of her for taking housekeeping work at the Hendersons. She came without the prepared expression of sympathy she had worn that morning. She came with a notebook and questions that showed she had thought carefully before coming. I answered her questions the same way I answered everyone's: patient, precise, without holding anything back. She asked me at the end how I had kept my nerve through the winter alone. She asked it directly the way a woman asks when she genuinely wants to know, and has set aside the social forms that usually soften such questions into something safer. I thought about it before answering. My grandfather spent 35 years underground, I said. He was afraid sometimes the way anyone is afraid in a dark place. But he told me that fear and capability are not opposites. You can be afraid and capable at the same time. The fear does not cancel the knowing. It just makes the knowing feel more urgent. She wrote that down. Some of the women wrote things down. Others just listened, holding the information. The way my grandfather had told me, you hold certain kinds of knowledge, not in notes, but in the body where it will be available when you need it. I recognized both approaches because I had used both of them with him. I knew which one had served me better in the end. Harriet Farwell came back the following week with 3 women from the sewing circle, and they sat at my table and talked with me for an afternoon about the winter and what I had observed in the people who came to the ledger and the people who did not. The conversation was not about root cellars at all. It was about the difference between community as a word people use and community as a practice people do, and about what makes it possible for people to ask for help without losing something essential in the asking. That conversation came not from my grandfather directly, but from the winter itself, from the specific experience of receiving people at my barn door and watching the way they held themselves when they came, and the way they held themselves differently when they left. But the foundation that made it possible to receive those people and see them clearly, that foundation was his, given across a kitchen table in the evenings of his last years, received carelessly at first, and then received fully in the one winter that required the full receiving. The summer of 1885 was a good one. The rains came at the right intervals. The wheat grew heavy, and the harvest was the best the county had seen in 5 years. The general store had full shelves. The conversations in Promise were different from the year before, less careful, less freighted with the unspoken weight of that winter. I expanded the root cellar on the Abernathy property that summer, adding a second chamber with stone walls instead of timbered shoring. The ventilation system enlarged to serve the greater volume. I planned the work myself, and Lester Pruitt and Elbert Crane helped with the heavy digging while I directed from above, specifying the measurements and the timber cuts the way my grandfather had once specified them to me. I was 19 years old that July, overseeing experienced men twice my age on a construction project I had designed based on principles I had learned from a dead man. And none of them questioned my authority because the principles were right and the work showed it. And the results of the previous winter were in everyone's memory. Temperance Bly came in September to report that her cellar had kept through the summer, with the temperature steady through the worst of the August heat, and that she had stored enough preserved food to last her farm through 2 winters if it came to that. She came to tell me this the way you tell a teacher something the teacher will want to know as a completion of something that started in conversation and deserved to be finished in conversation. She said your grandfather must have been a remarkable man. He was, I said. He was ordinary in almost every way except that he paid attention. He paid attention to what the earth was trying to tell him, and he paid attention to what was worth passing on. Those two things together are not as common as they should be. After she left, I went down into the cellar and checked the shelves and read the thermometer and checked the candle test at the low pipe and found everything as it should be. The air moving in its slow, continuous circuit. The temperature steady. The stored food clean and intact. The years settled into their ordinary patterns after that. The county recovered from the grasshopper year with the thoroughness of a place that has decided to continue. New families arrived. The rail service improved. The town of promise grew by the ordinary increments of a county town in the years of the cattle drives and the steady westward pull of people looking for land. I married at 22 a man named Cornelius Webb, who had come to Kansas from Ohio the year after the grasshopper swarm and had the quality of attention that I had learned by then to recognize as the most important thing in a person after honesty. He had no knowledge of underground work and no family history of root cellars, and he listened to what I explained with the complete patience of someone who understands that knowledge does not sort itself by age or gender, and arrives from wherever it arrives, and the only sensible response is to pay attention to it. We had 3 children. I taught each of them about the cellar, the way my grandfather had taught me in the practical way, bringing them down the stairs and showing them the timber work and the ventilation pipes and explaining the principles. I was a better teacher than my grandfather, in one specific sense that I had the additional advantage of knowing which parts of the explanation the listener was most likely to receive carelessly, because I had been exactly that listener. I took particular care with the notch and with the 2-pipe system, and with the distinction between cold and even which my grandfather had taught me as a fact, and which I taught as a principle along with its consequences when the principle is ignored. In the summer of 1905, a young man came from Topeka on behalf of a newspaper, running a series on the 1884 grasshopper year. He had been sent to Holt County because someone at the county courthouse had mentioned my name in connection with the property transfer from Aldrich, and he had followed the thread. He sat at my table, the same table where Harlan Aldrich had signed his documents in January of 1885, and he asked me questions for most of a morning. I was 39 years old, and I answered him plainly. I showed him the cellar. He went down the stairs and stood on the stone floor in the cool underground air and looked at the shelves and the pipes and the thermometer on its nail. And when he came back up, his face had the quality I had seen on many faces over the years, that particular mixture of practical wonder and something more personal, that the underground evenness produced in people who understood what it meant. He asked me how old I had been when I built it. 18, I said. He was quiet for a moment. Then he said he thought what I had done was remarkable. What I did was practical. I told him my grandfather was the remarkable one. He spent 35 years learning what the earth remembers. And then he sat at a kitchen table and tried to give it away to a granddaughter who was not paying sufficient attention. That is the remarkable part. Most of what people call remarkable is just someone finally paying attention to something they were told a long time ago. He wrote it down. I watched him write and thought about my grandfather at his kitchen table in the last years of his life. The coffee cup in his hands. The unhurried voice. The patience of a man who understood that some things cannot be said quickly, and that the saying of them correctly matters more than whether they are received correctly in the moment of saying. He had known I was not fully listening. I am certain of that. He had told me anyway. He had given me every detail of the timber work and the 2-pipe system and the thermal mass and the distinction between cold and even. And he had given them plainly and precisely, and without visible frustration, at my partial attention, because he was a man who had spent 35 years underground, learning to trust the process and not require immediate confirmation of it. I had been his process, I had not confirmed him until the winter of 1884, and by that time he had been 4 years in the ground. But the knowledge he gave me had worked as he intended it to work, and the people who had survived that winter because of it were real and alive and working their fields in the spring of 1885 and the springs after that. The article appeared in the Topeka paper in September of 1905. I read it once and found it accurate in its facts and somewhat elevated in its language, which is the nature of newspaper articles about things that were in the living of them, simply practical necessity. But the elevation did not trouble me. My grandfather had earned whatever elevation his knowledge received. I wore his gloves the morning I took the young reporter down into the cellar. He noticed them on my hands and asked about them. My grandfather's, I said. He wore them in the coal mines in Pennsylvania for 35 years. Then he wore them digging the first root cellar on this land. They have a good history in them. He wrote that down too. I kept the cellars stocked and maintained through every season for the rest of my years on the cross farm. I replaced the shoring timbers when they showed softness. I cleaned the ventilation pipes every spring. I kept the ledgers current, the accounts of every transaction that passed through the Abernathy barn and then through the cross farm itself, the fair terms and the dates and the careful itemized columns that represented a community's capacity to survive its worst years by being honest with each other about what each person had to give and what they needed in return. The ledger from the winter of 1884 I kept on the bottom shelf alongside the others, all of them bound in the same plain covers. The first entry in that first ledger was Vera Garner's name, dated October of 1884. The first person who had come to me not for charity but for a transaction conducted with dignity on both sides. The last entry was Harlan Aldrich's, a blank in the labor column. The only blank in all the ledgers, because some debts are real and genuine and still cannot be expressed in standard terms. Between those two entries was the record of an entire community's worst winter, organized into columns of names and dates and fair measures, the account of what people can do for each other when someone is willing to keep honest books and hold the terms to a standard that asks something real of everyone and protects everyone at the same time. I want to say one final thing about the particular kind of inheritance my grandfather gave me, and about why it worked when so much else that year did not. He gave me the specifications first. That is how knowledge must begin, with specifics, with measurements and dimensions and the names of techniques and the angles of cuts. 12 feet by 10 feet, 8 feet deep. Notched shoring locked into horizontal plates top and bottom. 2 pipes, one low near the floor and one high near the ceiling. These are the facts, and they do not vary, and they are where any useful teaching must start. But specifications alone are not the whole of it. I know this because I had the specifications and I drove the shoring vertically, and the east wall collapsed in the first hard rain. The difference between doing a thing because it was done before and doing a thing because you understand why it works is the difference between a skill and a knowledge. The skill fails when the conditions change. The knowledge adapts. My grandfather had both. He had the specifications and he had the understanding of why each specification was what it was, the principle behind the measurement. He tried to give me both, and I received the specifications more readily than the principles, because specifications are concrete and principles require the kind of thinking that only becomes possible after you have failed at the application. The thinking came later. It came in the dark at the bottom of the collapsed hole, with the rain on my shoulders and the ruined timber around me, and the full weight of what I had not understood pressing on me with the clarity that only failure produces. That is the particular education of failure, that it does not allow you to maintain the comfortable distance between hearing something and knowing it. Failure closes that distance by force. He was patient with the time this required. He had watched too many things take a long time to be impatient with the timeline of a granddaughter's understanding. The coal takes millions of years to form and 2 hours to cut. The earth takes all winter to warm at depth and all summer to cool. The patience required by the material is not optional. You match your patience to the material's timeline or you do damage. He matched his patience to mine. He taught me at the pace I was able to receive, which was slower than either of us would have chosen. If we had known how little time we had, and when he died he left me with enough of the knowing to reconstruct the rest from consequence. That is the best kind of teaching. The kind that gives the student enough to find the rest on their own. I tried to teach that way. When Temperance Bly sat at my table with her diagram, I gave her the specifications and the principles, and the candle test and the story of the collapsed east wall. Because each of those things was a different angle on the same understanding, and I did not know which one would reach her. I gave them all and trusted her to take what she needed. My grandfather gave me something durable. I know this because it survived the period of my partial attention, and the period of my ignorance, and the winter when I needed it most. And it survived also the transmission to others, which is the truest test of whether a knowledge is genuine or merely local and personal. A genuine principle works in soils it has never been tested in conditions its originator never anticipated, in the hands of people the originator never met. The notch worked in Temperance Bly's high water table clay. The two-pipe system worked in Elbert Crane's modified configuration. The temperature held steady in cellars I never saw, dug by people I knew only from a conversation at my table. That is the arithmetic my grandfather understood and tried to pass on. Knowledge that saves only its holder is knowledge poorly used. Knowledge given away multiplies. He was right about that, as he was right about all of it. He was a man who paid 35 years of the hardest kind of attention to the earth, and came out of it with something worth giving, and he gave it without keeping any part of it back. And the giving outlasted him by decades, and is outlasting me now, spreading outward through the county in cellars I did not build, and conversations I was not present for, and the slow, reliable breath of two pipes drawing cool air from the stable underground, and exhausting warm air from the stored and tended world above. I should also tell you what happened to Harlan Aldrich's wife, because her story is part of this one, and it would be incomplete without it. She recovered. Not quickly, not without difficulty, but she recovered. By March, she was well enough to sit up, and by April, she was walking in the yard, and by May she was seen in town thin and careful. In her movements with a cane she had not used before the illness, but walking. Harlan Aldrich sold the bank to a man from Topeka in April, and moved his household east before the end of the month. He did not come to the barn again, and he did not send word, and I did not expect either. There are transactions that complete themselves and leave no residue on either side. That one was among them. The house on our family's farm I repaired through the summer of 1885 and moved back into by autumn, leaving the Abernathy barn as a working building storage and workshop, the cellar in it kept stocked as a secondary reserve. My mother came back from Ellsworth in September and walked through the rooms of the house she had left in June, thinking she would not return to it. And she was quiet for a long time after, moving through the rooms the way you move through a place you had decided was lost and have found return to you, carefully touching things to make sure they are real things too. She planted the kitchen garden that October. She put up 30 jars of preserved tomatoes and beans before the first frost. She moved through the kitchen with the efficiency of someone who has been restored to work that is genuinely hers. And I watched her and thought about my grandfather's principle that to account for a person's contribution, honestly, is to take them seriously. And I thought that perhaps a kitchen garden and 30 jars of preserves was its own kind of ledger, its own record of what a person has to give and what they have chosen to give it to. Lester Pruitt's family farmed the adjacent section for the next 20 years. His daughters grew up knowing my name and came to me with questions over the years the way people come to someone they have decided can be trusted with real questions. His wife Agnes brought me jars of her preserved peaches every autumn, and never once commented on the unconventionality of my living arrangements, which made her, in my estimation, a person of exceptional quality. Other women came, not just to learn about cellars. Some came because they had heard that a girl who had been left with nothing had built something that held, and they wanted to understand how that was possible. And the answer I gave them was always the same. I had a grandfather who paid attention. He paid attention to the earth, and he paid attention to me, and the combination of those two attentions given across a kitchen table in the evenings over years had been enough to make the difference between surviving a hard winter and not surviving it. He was not a famous man. He was not written about before the Topeka Reporter came in 1905. He was a coal miner from Pennsylvania who moved west and farmed and sat at a kitchen table in the evenings and tried to give away everything he had learned in the dark to a granddaughter who eventually, when it mattered most, received it. The cellar was deepened and expanded in the summer of 1886. A second chamber added to the original built with a stone foundation. This time, and better shelving, the ventilation system enlarged to serve the greater volume. I did the planning, and Lester and Elbert Crane did the heavy digging while I directed from above, citing measurements and specifying timber cuts with the precision of someone who has learned their subject from its consequences. The Cross Farm ran at a steady profit for the next 15 years, not spectacularly. The prairie does not offer spectacular in most years, but steadily in the way that careful work and honest bookkeeping and a root cellar stocked against the contingency of bad seasons produce steady results over time. I kept the ledgers current through all of it. The accounts of every transaction that passed through the farm, the fair terms and the dates, and the careful, itemized columns that represented a community's capacity to survive its worst years. By being honest with each other about what each person had to give and what they needed in return. The ledger from the winter of 1884. I kept on the bottom shelf of the cellar, in a place of honor, alongside the others. The first entry in that first ledger was Vera Garner's name. The last entry was Harlan Aldrich's, with the blank in the labor column that was the only blank in all the ledgers. Between those two entries lay the whole account of what that community had been through and what had kept it together. The record of what people can do when someone is willing to hold the terms honestly and ask something real of everyone and protect everyone at the same time. My grandfather kept books that way his whole life. He passed that habit to me along with the root cellar knowledge and the 2 pipes and the dairy thermometer and the worn leather gloves. I wore those gloves the last morning I descended those stairs. I stood for a moment at the bottom and looked at the shelves and the thermometer and the ventilation pipes carrying their slow breath through the earth. And I thought about the boy who had gone underground at 15 in a Pennsylvania coal mine and spent the better part of his life learning what the earth held and how to work with it. And the evening he had brought a 15-year-old girl down into a root cellar and told her the earth was not cold but even. And there was a difference. There was a difference. He had been right about that, and about all of it. The knowing had cost him 35 years underground, and it had cost me 1 Kansas winter, and it had cost us both things I cannot fully account for. But knowledge that is given away does not diminish. That is the arithmetic my grandfather trusted when he gave me everything he knew across a kitchen table in the evenings of his last years. And the arithmetic was right. The earth remembers what the sky forgets. My grandfather understood that. He spent his life underground learning it. And he gave it to a girl who spent years above ground before she finally understood what he had been trying to tell her. And that girl gave it to anyone who would sit at her table and listen. Because knowledge that saves only its holder is knowledge poorly used. She had learned that from the work itself in the hard, specific way that all true knowledge is learned through the hands, through the failure and the rebuilding through the long, cold dark, where the only company is what the people you have loved left inside you when they went. 56 degrees. The earth holds it steady. There is something I have not yet said about the ledger and what it meant to the people whose names were in it. And I want to say it before I finish. The ledger was not merely an accounting document. It was, in a way I had not fully intended when I started it, a form of recognition. Each name I wrote in it was a statement that the person bearing that name was a capable party to a real transaction, not a recipient of pity, not a case to be managed by the church or the county, not a problem to be resolved by someone else's charity. Each name said, this person has something to give and something they need, and the exchange between those two facts is legitimate and worth recording. This mattered more than I understood at first. I began to understand it when I watched how people carried themselves differently after signing the ledger than they had when they arrived at the barn door. Philip Garner arrived with the careful posture of a man who had rehearsed maintaining his dignity in difficult circumstances. He left with something less performed and more genuine in his bearing. The rehearsed dignity was gone because the circumstances that required it were gone. He had made a transaction. He had given labor for food. He was not in debt to anyone's generosity. He was in a fair exchange with someone who kept honest books. That shift in bearing happened with nearly everyone who came to the ledger. Greta Hollis arrived with the particular practiced quietness of a widow who has learned to take up as little space as possible in a world that has already contracted around her. She left having negotiated terms for her quilting skill terms. She had proposed herself, and she walked back toward town with her head at a different angle than it had been at arrival. I thought about this often in the years after, about why the ledger had that effect. And I came to believe it was because the ledger asked something real of people rather than simply offering them relief. Relief is passive. It requires nothing of the recipient except the willingness to receive it. The ledger required each person to assess what they had and offer it honestly and commit to terms they could fulfill. The act of that assessment, that honest inventory of one's own capacity, is itself a form of dignity. My grandfather had told me that keeping honest books was a way of treating people seriously. I had understood him to mean a technical thing, that accurate records prevented disputes. I understood later that he meant something larger, that to account for a person's contribution, honestly, is to take them seriously as a person, and to be taken seriously is one of the things that people need as much as food. He had kept books that way his whole life, with the miners he worked beside, with the farmers who were his neighbors in Kansas, with the merchants in Ellsworth who supplied him. He applied the same standard to everyone and expected the same honesty in return, and was not disappointed more often than any person doing honest business is disappointed, which is occasionally and not fatally. He had given me that practice along with the root cellar and the gloves and the 2 pipes and the distinction between cold and even. And it had served me that winter as surely as the thermal mass of the earth had served me quietly and reliably, and in ways that extended well beyond the original intention. I want to return to something I said earlier about the specifications and the principles, because I think there is one more thing to be said about it that I have not yet said cleanly. The specifications are the floor. They are the minimum required to build something that works. 8 feet deep, notched shoring, 2 pipes, 56 degrees. These numbers and their relationships to each other are not negotiable if you want the outcome they produce. My grandfather did not invent them. He learned them from the material from the earth itself, from 35 years of underground work and conditions that enforced honesty. You cannot argue with a mine shaft about whether the shoring is adequate. The shaft will tell you one way or the other, and the telling is final. The principles are the ceiling. They are what allows you to adapt the specifications to conditions the original builder never encountered. When Elbert Crane came with his modification for high water table clay, the principles told me whether the modification would hold the same outcome at different specifications. When Temperance Bly asked why the notch mattered, the principle was what I gave her, not the specification, because the principle was what she would need when she encountered conditions I could not anticipate for her. My grandfather gave me both. He gave me the floor in explicit measurements and the ceiling in explanations of why each measurement was what it was. I received the floor more completely than I received the ceiling, which is the common error, because floors are concrete and ceilings require imagination. The ceiling became available to me only after the east wall collapse, which is to say, after the floor had proven insufficient on its own, and the principle behind it was the only thing that could explain what had gone wrong and what to do about it. That is the shape of most real learning. The floor comes first from explicit instruction, or from observation, or from reading. The ceiling comes later from failure, from the moment when the floor proves insufficient, and you need to understand why it is what it is in order to know what to do next. The floor without the ceiling is a skill. The ceiling without the floor is a theory. Together they are knowledge, the specific kind of knowledge that can be given away and arrive intact and work in the hands of a stranger, in conditions its originator never saw. My grandfather understood this. I believe he gave me both, deliberately knowing that I was receiving them at different rates, trusting that the floor would be there when I needed it, and that the ceiling would become available when the floor proved insufficient. He was right. He was right about all of it. The years passed. The county changed around me the way counties change at the turn of a new century. The automobile arrived. The telephone wire ran along the county road. The rail service became more reliable. The general store carried goods that would have seemed luxuries in the winter of 1884. The memory of the grasshopper year and the blizzard faded for most people at the rate that hard memories fade when the present is more comfortable than the past. I did not let it fade. Not because I am a person who clings to difficult memories, but because the memory had a use. It was the memory of what had been possible when the right knowledge was in the right hands at the right moment, and keeping it clear kept available the question. It implied, what knowledge do I have that someone else might need? And am I giving it away at the pace and completeness it deserves? That question shaped the remainder of my years on the Cross Farm, the years after the reporter from Topeka and the article in 1905, the years in which the county built a library and a new schoolhouse, and the lives of the people in Holt County expanded into the new century, with a confidence that was, I thought, partly built on the foundation of that one hard winter, having been survived together. The people who had come to my ledger in the winter of 1884 knew something that the people who had not come to it did not quite know, which is what it feels like to ask for what you need and receive a fair answer and give something real in return. That transaction, repeated across the names in the ledger, had worked its way into the community's sense of itself. It was there in the way people helped each other in subsequent hard years, not as charity, but as the practical recognition that fair exchange is possible, even in difficult circumstances, and that the person who keeps honest books is serving the whole community by doing so. My grandfather would have recognized that. It was what he had been doing in his quiet way for the 30 years he spent in Kansas, keeping accounts that were fair, and applying the same standard to everyone, and trusting that honesty well practiced would compound over time the way a well-maintained cellar compounds its usefulness. Each good year adding to the reserve that will be needed in the bad year that is always coming eventually. He was right about that too. I'm giving it to you now. I want to go back to one morning in particular. Not the morning of the swarm or the night of the block pipe, or the January morning when Harlan Aldrich walked into the barn, but an ordinary morning in late October of 1884, about 6 weeks into the winter I have been describing. I had come down into the cellar on my regular morning check. The temperature was exactly as it had always been. The jars were intact. The sacks were sound. The candle flame bent toward the low pipe as it always did. Everything was exactly as it should be. I had nothing to fix, nothing to worry about, nothing to adjust. The system was working, and I had only to confirm that it was working, which I did in 10 minutes. And then there was nothing left to do but stand in the underground cool and listen to the faint movement of air through the pipes. I stood there for longer than the check required. I'm not sure why at first. And then I understood. I was standing in the thing my grandfather had built and listening to it breathe, and for the first time, I was not in it to check it or repair it or respond to an emergency. I was in it simply to be in it, to feel the way the temperature held steady against whatever the sky above was doing, to hear the slow, even breath of the two pipes, doing exactly what he had said they would do, to stand in the proof of everything he had tried to tell me. He had been right about all of it, not just the temperature and the pipes and the notch and the thermal mass. About the larger thing those specifics were in service of, which is that the earth holds what it is given with a fidelity that the sky cannot match, and that if you understand this and build accordingly, you can survive what the sky delivers without being destroyed by it. You can preserve through summer what you need in winter. You can store through good years against the bad years that are always coming. You can be prepared for the emergency before you know what form the emergency will take. That is the whole of what he knew and the whole of what he tried to give me. The specifications were the vehicle. The principle they carried was this fidelity. The earth is faithful. It holds what it is given. It does not forget. It does not lose patience with the length of time required. It keeps. I thought about my grandfather keeping that kind of fidelity in his own life. 35 years underground in conditions that were genuinely dangerous, keeping the books honestly teaching what he knew to whoever would sit still long enough to receive it. Keeping faith with the people around him in the ordinary daily way of someone who has decided that fairness is not a sometimes thing. Keeping faith with me specifically in the years of my inattention, continuing to give what I was not yet ready to receive. Trusting that I would be ready eventually. That is a form of love, not the dramatic kind. The kind that keeps a thing going with the same quality of attention over a long period of time. Because the thing is worth keeping. The coal miners called it staying long. You stayed long at the face of the coal long after your arms were tired and your back hurt, and the lamp was getting low, because the coal was there, and the work was real, and you had said you would do it, and you did it. He stayed long with me. He gave me what I needed to build a root cellar and keep a ledger and survive a winter that the rest of the community nearly did not survive. And he gave it to me in the years before I knew I would need it, in the ordinary evenings of an ordinary life, in the voice of a man who trusted the process of giving, without requiring confirmation that it would be received. I think about him every time I go into any cellar. I think about him when I feel the temperature drop as I descend the stairs, and the cool, even air rises around me, and the thermometer on the wall reads exactly as it always has. I think about him when I hear the faint movement of air through the pipes, in and out, the slow, continuous breath of a system doing exactly what it was designed to do. I think you were right about all of it, Grandpa Harmon. You were right about the specifications and the principles and the patience required and the arithmetic of knowledge given away. You were right that the earth remembers what the sky forgets. And you were right to trust that I would eventually understand what you meant by that. The candle flame bends toward the pipe. The mercury holds at 56 degrees. The earth keeps.